to renew those tissues and cells that have incurred damage. And of course, simply as a consequence of existing and metabolizing, we incur damage. So if the majority or a substantial amount of those interventions that have been found to extend lifespan and enhance health entail the modulation, the augmentation generally of autophagy, it stands to reason that this aim of optimizing autophagy ought to be an aim of any intervention that aims to extend lifespan and heighten health. It is also important to consider that the two most fundamental anti-aging interventions, caloric restriction and cyclic fasting, operate primarily through the mechanism of augmenting autophagy, optimizing autophagy. And of course, those of you who have read Air Volume 1 know the importance of the detractors of anti-aging interventions, and more recently, the duodecimus or dodecahedron. Those are all of those scientific interventions that have been found to extend maximum lifespan in one or more mammalian organisms. And those of you who have followed the regimen and AIR for some time know of the centrality of the duodecimus, the dodecahedron, and early on the detractors. And the reason that I bring this up is because there are distinct interventions that operate through the mechanism of autophagy induction, most specifically that intervention which finds that the administration of the drug rapamycin independently increases maximum lifespan. It's also important to note that exercise and its ability to extend maximum lifespan operates in part through the enhancement of autophagy. So all of these interventions, which have been found to increase maximum lifespan, that operate through the mechanism of autophagy, reinforce our confidence that this is central to health enhancement and life extension. But you will have heard me mention not simply increasing autophagy, but optimizing autophagy. And this is highly important because if you go back to our definition and understanding of autophagy, autophagy entails the catabolism of cells and tissues. And it cannot be a good thing to uniformly increase the catabolism of normal and healthy tissue. There must be a limitation to the degree to which the degradation of cells and tissues is a good thing. So that is why it is important to speak of optimizing autophagy, not simply increasing autophagy. Of course, this is also the reason that the Amen regimen does not entail extended fasting. And by extended, I simply mean fasting that is much longer than the duration of a day. There is a reason why the Orthodox Amen fast is approximately 22 to 23 hours in duration, and that it does not go typically beyond a day, unless we are talking about individuals who are using the Amen regimen for clinical reasons that relate to chemotherapy, radiation therapy, etc. But that is not the focus of our discussion presently. So again, we're talking about the optimization of autophagy and not simply increasing autophagy uniformly. So much of the text that is the fourth tractate of Volume 2, Autophagy and the Amen Fast, relates to explaining how the Amen regimen in general and the Amen fast in particular uniquely optimizes autophagy. And of course, that relates to the order of the Amen regimen. The fact that we begin our day with persistence exercise, then we have our day-long fast. We end the day with resistance exercise, and then we have our nocturnal repast. So there is a reason for this order. Those individuals who accept the utility of fasting and day-long fasting will often inquire, well, I accept that fasting is beneficial, but is it necessary to fast until the end of the day? Cannot I begin my day with fasting, or rather feeding, and break my fast midday? And my answer is yes, but not in keeping with the Orthodox Amen regimen. And there is a reason. I will hint to the fact that the reason relates to growth hormone. And the importance of this is that fasting increases growth hormone release. So throughout the course of a fast, growth hormone increases. And among other effects, this is intended, quote unquote, evolutionarily speaking, to promote the preservation of muscle tissue amidst what is called starvation or fasting. There are other effects on other tissues, the liver, adipose tissue as well. But in terms of our present interest, it is important to relate that there's a relationship between growth hormone, autophagy, and fasting that makes engaging in resistance exercise at the end of the day opportune. Now, I mentioned that we begin the day with persistence, then we fast, then we engage in resistance at the end of the day, and then we feed. But of course, there is the Amen apothecary, and this is of integral importance to the regimen. So there are agents that we ingest over the course of the fast that also augment and optimize autophagy. And this is an important consideration. Now, in the context of growth hormone, I did not mention that among the most important health enhancing effects is the preservation of muscle mass and muscle strength. It's not simply aesthetic. It is important to realize that the progressive loss of muscle mass and muscle strength is perhaps the single most deleterious effect of aging. And that phenomenon that will tend to compromise health and vitality to the greatest degree. That is, whatever one's absolute maximum lifespan, if one incurs a progressive and substantial reduction of muscle mass and muscle strength, that will compromise the quality of life. And that is why the inhibition of sarcopenia, the maintenance of muscle mass and muscle strength, is so central to the Amen regimen and so central to any regimen protocol that purports to prolong life and enhance health. The relevance of this to autophagy is that it is important to inhibit autophagy at opportune times. And that opportune time is at the end of the day, such that when one engages in morning persistence exercise that depletes glycogen and reduces circulating sugar, that is, of course, beneficial from the standpoint of glycation. Glycation, like autophagy, is one of those fundamental physiological phenomena whose modulation is associated with lifespan determination and health. So there is that morning depletion of glucose and glycogen, which forces the body to utilize primarily stored energy throughout the course of the fast. So during that period, Growth hormone is increasing, autophagy is increasing, and the body is making use of tissues that it is catabolizing. But at the end of the day, one wants to bring about a diminution, if not a cessation, of that autophagic process. And it is the provisionment of nutrients that does that, so that in the course of engaging in resistance exercise, there is some catabolism that is taking place. But resistance exercise can also have the effect of increasing the deposition of proteins into the myocytes. And that is precisely what growth hormone effectuates. But when that is accompanied by the provisionment of nutrients, and this underscores the importance of the Amen amino elixir, it is not simply eating, but the eating, the ingestion of particular agents that is effective in the inhibition of autophagy and the maintenance of muscle. So, in order to bring about an optimal cessation of autophagy, an optimal diminution of autophagy, it is ideal to ingest particular amino acids that have a hypertrophic effect. And this, again, illustrates the importance of the Amen amino elixir. In this exposition, I've delineated the nature of the Amen regimen. But of course, there are many details that I'm leaving out. And I don't want to discuss too many elements of the forthcoming text because I want to send you to that text as soon as it is available. So presently, I'm going to open up our dialogue for dialogue as such and cease this monologue. So we are going to look at any questions that you have shared with us. And if you have yet to do so, I invite you to do so. So,
Okay. We have our first question from Bio Ade. Thanks for the opportunity to ask a question, doctor. Can you give more of an idea of Saturday exercises I can execute in the evening, those that don't interfere with deadlifts the next day?
that's a very good question and an opportune one because that is precisely how I endeavor to structure, particularly my Saturday exercises, because the deadlift is so central. So basically, I confine my Saturday resistance exercise to abdominal exercises because I find that that does not interfere with my execution of the deadlift. So Saturday, I devote to abdominal exercises and also lower leg exercises. But I would caution you that if you find that lower leg exercises, the gastrocnemius, the soleus, the tibialis in anterior, do not interfere with your execution of the deadlift, then those are fine to do. And I limit the duration of my exercise session on Saturdays to about 15 minutes. So I begin with persistence as usual, engage in about 15 minutes of walking either outdoors or inclined on the treadmill, and then I'll do resistance for 16 minutes. So it's about a half hour exercise session on Saturdays. And I also begin my day in that way with persistence exercise. So persistence in the morning, and then about 30 minutes in the evening prior to deadlifts on Saturday. I hope that answers your question, Bio.
Ramana asks, how does one know one has effectuated optimal autophagy? Is there a sign like increased hunger by need of day, etc.?
That is a very good question, Dr. Ramana. And there is no empirical, practical way of assessing the degree of autophagy that one is undergoing. But there are signs. You suggest one, hunger. I'm not certain, frankly, how good of an indicator the perception of hunger is as to the degree or intensity of autophagy. But I think over the long term, if one finds that one is able to execute physical activities in a way that is not compromised, that is a sign that one is undergoing adequate autophagy. I will say that there are interesting studies that I'm citing presently in the tractate, which indicate that when one's level of growth hormone is adequate and relatively high, that one is less likely to experience hypoglycemia of a degree that compromises activity. So, one of the effects of growth hormone is to enhance autophagy and to provide more metabolic substrates for the execution of activity, physical and mental. So perhaps more invasively, if one has an idea of one's circulating concentration of growth hormone, that might be an indirect indication of the extent of autophagy transpiring in the body. So the thinking is that amidst the fast, this is an important caveat, permit me to back up. In animals, it seems that the characterization of the pulsatility of growth hormone is more straightforward. That is, it is known that mammals will have a stereotypic pulsatile secretion of growth hormone. In human beings, in the studies of which I'm familiar, human beings who feed regularly, frequently throughout the day, have a very chaotic and irregular exudation, release of growth hormone. But humans who fast or are subjected to cyclic fasting, the regulation of growth hormone release is much more stereotypic, much more regular, much more circadian. So it is only in people who are adapted to fasting that the extent of growth hormone is an indication of the amount of autophagy that is transpiring in the body. So, to simplify my convoluted statement, one way of determining the degree of autophagy transpiring in the body without directly measuring autophagy is by determining the amount of growth hormone circulating during a fast in someone who is adapted to fasting. I hope that answers your question, Dr. Ramon. Thank you.
Alfonso asks, what is the optimal duration for the persistence, resistance training, and meditation sessions?
Very good questions. So, in volume 4, tractate 1, I begin with that all important study, which demonstrates that persistence exercise or aerobic exercise independently increases maximum lifespan in a mammalian model. And there is a particular duration and intensity of exercise that is quantified in that important study. However, that is a study in rodents. So it is somewhat difficult to extrapolate those findings directly to human beings. But I discuss a plethora of other studies in human beings that give some indication of the amount of persistence exercise that is optimal. So suffice it to say that I have found, based upon this analysis, which is partly objective, partly subjective, partly experiential, that the amount of persistence that is optimal to engage in is about 15 minutes daily, with the addition of 15 minutes thrice weekly before power lifts. And that is the amount, the minimal amount of persistence exercise in which I engage. And that is incidentally the amount of persistence exercise which has been found to promote the preservation of telomeres. And I think there is an important linkage there. So I hope that simplifies my answer concerning persistence exercise. Resistance exercise is a bit different. And I think that depends on a lot of factors. As you know, in the Amen exercise regimen for everyone, the resistance regimen is predicated upon the power lifts. That is the deadlift, the squat, and the bench press. So in part, the duration of the power lifts specifically, and those are only thrice weekly in terms of the resistance regimen. The other 4 days entail other supportive exercises. But to give you an idea of the optimal and adequate duration, it takes me about a half hour to execute each of the power lifts, the squat, the deadlift, the bench press. And the duration of my exercise is typically an hour for powerlift workouts. So half the time is spent on the power lifts, and the other half is spent on various supportive exercises that tend to stimulate the same muscle groups as the power lift. So on squat day, I'll be doing leg extensions, leg press, etc. Those same muscle groups that the squat works. So I would say for power lifts, the duration of your exercise session should be in the range of 1 hour. Sometimes I extend my workout to about 90 minutes, and that is not atypical, especially for the deadlift. Now, the other intervening accessory days for resistance, that is typically a half hour. It can be less. Of course, it depends on the time that you have available and the intensity of your exercise and what your particular goals are. Are you maintaining strength and body weight? Are you competing for a particular sport or physical activity? Those are factors that you should consider that partly determine the duration and intensity of your resistance exercise regimen. Now, meditation, another important factor to consider in terms of time. That is more difficult to answer because it too depends on a multiplicity of factors. But what I would say is that you should integrate two defined meditation sessions during the day. And I tend to meditate at the very outset of the day before I even commence my hygiene. And I do that in a lying position upon waking. The duration can depend on the time that you have available and the particular need that you find for meditation at the time. So I typically begin my day with lying meditation, and that can be as brief as 6 minutes or as long as 16 minutes or upwards of a half hour. And we always end our day with group meditation before feeding. So after resistance exercise, we end the day ritualistically with a brief meditation session, standing or lying. And that's typically in the range of 6 to 10 minutes. Now, that is the amount of meditation that I find adequate for maintaining the degree of, for lack of a better term, tranquility and focus that I need to function optimally, psychologically, and even physically. However, that is not the amount of meditation that I needed in order to gain a degree of what I would call mastery. And for that, I found longer periods of meditation to be necessary, half hour, even 90 plus minutes. So again, it depends on where you are in your particular development, in your particular journey. If you could give me one moment while okay, as you were, all is well. So again, I would say assess your particular state psychologically, philosophically, even metaphysically. Do the minimal amount of meditation that you can consistently do, because there is also no need to compel yourself to follow a regimen that you're not going to be able to execute. So I would suggest that you give yourself a minimal, actionable amount of meditation per day. Morning upon waking, evening before breaking your fast, and then integrate more extended intervals of meditation as you are able throughout the day. And I hope that answers your question adequately, Alfonso. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, maybe you can answer these two at the same time because they're both about body fat.
Okay.
So Carlos asks, is body fat percentage usually a good indicator of optimal autophagy? Thank you for the lecture, dear brother. And then Roberto asked, is the ideal 0% body fat for replenishment of tissues?
Okay, good questions. I'll answer the latter first. 0% body fat.
And then we'll answer George's. That'll be the last one.
Okay. 0% body fat is not at all ideal. Fat serves several important, essential, vital functions. And so you don't want to have exactly zero body fat. But in terms of an optimal amount of body fat to have, and is that indicative of autophagy? First, it's difficult to say what the optimal amount is. There is a range. And we know, again, hearkening back to the duodecimus, that minimization of body fat is productive of lifespan extension, because we know that the surgical removal of visceral body fat increases maximum lifespan in a mammalian organism. And we know that autophagy is increased when body fat is depleted. That makes sense, of course, because adipose tissue and the lipids stored in adipose tissue are a significant source of energy. So if you have that labile energy, your body is going to make use of that, and it's not going to engage in substantial catabolism of muscle tissue. So autophagy is not going to be optimal if you have a substantial amount of stored body fat. So my general answer is that it is good to minimize body fat to the greatest extent practicable by using the elements of the Amen regimen, with the understanding that autophagy is going to be optimized to a greater degree if you can minimize your amount of superfluous body fat. And it's important to understand that for the most part, our body fat is inert tissue that is not needed beyond a certain point. So it is good to minimize that and extirpate that to the extent practicable. If I'm not able to get to your questions, and I see that my Athenian brother has a question um, that you've posed, I'm going to hold off on that and I will commit to answering your question subsequently if it is in another live session or if it is in direct communication. So I invite you to continue this discourse, to write down your questions, formulate them, and let this endeavor be ongoing, protracted, and productive. So I have noted your questions and I endeavor to address them by and by. Again, I thank you all for joining us, and I wish you good health, happiness, and prosperity. Until next time, Hatep, peace.